It's been what, like 10 years since the Vita release, and guess who just got it? You know that console Sony ditched faster than a 17-year-old date on Tinder? Yep, that one. And you know, somehow, this little thing now is my most played handheld. You know, on paper, this thing could have changed everything. But instead, Sony strangled it with overpriced memory cards and apathy. It wasn't really a launch, it was more like an assisted suicide. You see, when I was a kid, handhelds were everything. My cousins and I sank ungodly hours into Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green on the Game Boy Advance SP. I alone racked up like 300 plus hours on that thing. That wasn't really my childhood, that was more like child labor now that I look back at it. But my cousins, they eventually upgraded to Xbox 360s, they had Halo 3, ODST and all that stuff. And I was stuck with the Game Boy. And that's when I learned the first rule of gaming. You see, it's not really about the passion that you have for the games or the consoles themselves. It's more about whether your parents have money. But eventually, I did save up, and I bought myself a PSP. I think it was the 2000 model, if I'm not wrong. You know, on that thing, I played a lot of FIFA. I played Lego Star Wars, NBA The Inside. I basically played these games on repeat, non-stop. I was addicted. And these games were basically Flintstone vitamins. You know, cheap, repetitive, and probably harmful in large doses. But for me, that handheld was the closest thing to owning a real or AAA console at the time. And then in a moment of teenage brilliance, I decided to sell my PSP. Because apparently, 15-year-old me thought $50 and a slap on the butt was worth erasing my entire childhood. And ironically, that was my first taste of regret, and if I'm honest, I've been chasing that high ever since. But here we are, it's what, 2025, 2026, whenever you're watching this. And yeah, I easily could have gone back to the PSP. You know, now I have big boy money, so I can make a purchase like that. But instead, I decided to buy something else. I decided to buy its weird, over-engineered offspring, the PlayStation Vita. A handheld I never owned, a handheld Sony abandoned, and somehow still standing around waiting for idiots like me to show up late to its funeral. So let's rewind a little bit. Before the Vita was Sony's neglected stepchild, they actually had a golden boy, the PSP. And it was everything the Vita wanted it to be, except, you know, successful. To start off, the PSP was already absurdly ambitious in 2004. You know, you could run games, music, movies, even go on the internet. In layman's terms, the PSP was like if you wanted Netflix, Spotify, and the App Store before they even existed. Which in theory does sound revolutionary, but you gotta remember, the browser barely worked, and the movies came on discs slightly bigger than a Ritz cracker. And if you jumped while playing, there was a chance that the PSP would just go kaputsy and you wouldn't be able to play or see anything for like, 5 minutes until you restarted the thing. But the PSP 2000, I think it was? Yeah, I think it was the 2000 one that I had. This one was like the slimmer, lighter, and it kind of looked more expensive. In a way, knockoff jewelry looks more expensive, like in that similar range. But still, I put hundreds of hours into this thing. It wasn't just my first handheld, it was at the time my only console. And I know it's a mobile handheld, but I kind of treated it like a console, which now kind of sounds charming, but in reality, it meant that while everyone else was playing GTA 4, I was unlocking C-3PO for like the 7th time in Lego Star Wars. But let's fast forward. Let's go to 2011. Sony launches the PlayStation Vita in Japan, and 2012 for the rest of us. And on paper, this thing looked like the future. You know, you had OLED screens, you had dual sticks, front touch, back touch, graphics so sharp, you briefly thought, hey, wait, is that a dog? I mean, it is, but barely. But then Sony immediately sabotaged it. You know, launch prices of what, $249 back then, which is like $381 today. That's basically like 2 months rent in most of South America. And the real kicker? These goddamn proprietary memory cards. Nope, not a normal cheap SD like the 3DS had. No, Sony wanted you to pay $120 for 32 gigabytes. 32 gigs? I mean, even in 2011, that was humiliating. They weren't really selling you storage, they were selling you the privilege of being scammed. And the worst part of it all, this thing didn't really have the support, you know, big game support. And you know, when the big games dried up, Sony didn't double down. They didn't even try. They ghosted their own console. Sure, you know, the launch had promise. You had Uncharted Golden Abyss, you had Killzone Mercenary, you had Gravity Rush, and of course, Tearaway. Now, I gotta say, Tearaway, this thing isn't just a game. It was proof that the Vita had life. Media Molecule, the geniuses behind this game, they took every dumb feature Sony crammed into the Vita and made it feel intentional and brilliant. The touchscreen was no longer just a gimmick. You actually peeled back the world with it. The rear touchpad wasn't useless. You poked through the landscape like an overenthusiastic grandpa with boundary issues. And I mean, even the cameras mattered. You would pull your ugly mug into this papercraft universe. Tearaway wasn't just another platform. It was the Vita finally living up to its pitch. And playing it today feels even more incredible. But it also makes everything else sting just a little more. Because the Vita didn't really fail from a lack of imagination or power, it failed from neglect. After the first initial wave, the cavalry never showed up. You had no God of War, no Gran Turismo, no GTA. You did have ports and I guess collections, but it's not the same. These million sellers stayed home. Eventually, all of Sony Studios defected to the PS4, and the Vita got, well, whatever was left in the pantry. By 2015, just a couple of years after its release, Sony slapped the Vita with the Legacy Platform label, which is corporate code for, hey, yeah, we're done with this, so please stop asking. And they didn't even give it a proper burial. They just let it slowly suffocate in the corner while slowly poking it with a stick to see if it's still alive. Well, guess what, Sony? Our stick is bigger than yours. By our stick, I mean like us, the fans. That's a weird metaphor, but whatever. Let's move on. Now you gotta remember that the Vita did have the hardware. The Vita did have the audience. What it didn't have was the support. So at the end, it didn't fail because players didn't care. It failed because Sony shot it in a dark alleyway and forgot to check its vital signs. And yeah, well, that's the history lesson no one really asked for. But let's talk about me now, because this is YouTube and oversharing is basically the business model. The other day I bought my first Vita and I was actually pleasantly surprised. You know, holding it in my hands did not feel old. It kind of felt futuristic. You got a solid build, sleek design, dual sticks that finally make sense on a handheld. It kind of feels like Sony had made this for today, but forgot to leave a memo, if that makes sense. Now the bundle that I got it off Marketplace. You know how shady Marketplace is, but thankfully this was a really good deal. The bundle I bought came with extras. It came with these thumbstick protectors, 2 memory cards, the proprietary one, which at the time this thing would have cost even more than the console. And it also came with a free copy of Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, which sounds generous until you play it and you kind of realize this isn't really much of a bonus, but more like Sony hazing you. It's kind of like buying a used car, and then the seller leaving Nickelback's greatest hits on the CD player. That's kind of what I felt. But anyway, I then turned on this console, and you know the whole more than a decade aspect of the Vita? That's when it really kicked in. This OS looks like some cheap iPhone knockoff you get from Temu. Temu? Anyway, the bubbly menus don't say PlayStation. They say Fisher Price. My first handheld. It's colorful, it's clunky, and it takes way too long to do literally anything. You don't really play the Vita, you kind of wait for it. But here's the thing, I mean, this thing is 10 years old. Like, what do you expect? Of course, the software feels like a child. Wait, I meant childish. Not like a child. Definitely not like a child. I meant childish. The surprise isn't that it's dated, it's that under this lifeless interface, which has its charm to be honest with you, the hardware, it's still beating, stronger, more capable, and way more versatile than Sony ever let on it to be when it was alive. So first impressions, surprisingly good. Very good actually, which immediately made me suspicious because nothing in my life ever stays good for long. But let's break down why the Vita is actually good now, when Sony spent so much time and effort making sure it wasn't. So what makes a Vita worth owning now? Well, it's simple. It finally does everything Sony refused to let it do, which is basically like a nun going to Coachella. I don't know why I said that metaphor, but I can see it. Can you see it? Yeah, that'd be weird, but probably does happen. First, let's talk about the screen. You know, I didn't get that mythical OLED screen. I got the slimmer Vita 2000 with the LCD. And you know what? It's still great. Bright, sharp, perfectly fine. People talk about the OLED like it's the lost Ark of the Covenant. Open it and your face melts if you dare to settle for the LCD. Come on, buddy, relax. It's just a handheld, not the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I mean, the LCD works. It's lighter. This version is way lighter, actually. It doesn't feel like I'm holding a collector's item in a hostage situation. I'm just holding a Vita. The second great thing about this beautiful portable device is emulation. For me, this is when the Vita stops being a neglected child and turns into a delinquent genius. You got NES, SNES, Game Boy Advance, PlayStation 1, PSP, it's all here. I can easily relive Pokemon Leaf Green, then move on to FIFA on my PSP for my older days, and I can even boot up Persona 4 Golden. And I know everyone insists this is one of the greatest JRPGs of all time, which is kind of ironic and hilarious because I can't stand JRPGs. For me, Persona is like being trapped in a visual novel where everyone wants to go shopping instead of addressing the apocalyptic murder plot. Yeah, people call it life-changing art. I call it's a very expensive waiting room. But the point is, the Vita can still run it. And for people who enjoy pressing X to validate digital teenagers, I guess that's a blessing. The third great thing about the Vita is the whole homebrew and mod scene. Sony tried to lock this thing down like Fort Knox, but the community cracked it open with a spoon and duct tape. Now, this thing can run custom themes, fan translations, indie ports, full emulators, apps Sony couldn't even have developed if you gave them a map and a flashlight. In reality, the Vita stopped being Sony's product years ago. And at this point, it belongs to the fans. And the fans, they made it into something Sony never had the imagination or huevos to do themselves. Fourth, yeah, there's a fourth point, the comfort and accessories. This Vita, specifically the 2000 model, looks so sleek, but ergonomically, it's a war crime. Holding one raw is like gripping a slippery soap bar in prison. That's why I bought this. Enter the third-party grip with actual L2 and R2 triggers. Suddenly, the Vita doesn't feel like arthritis. It's more like an actual controller. Without it, long sessions feel like putting your fingers in a blender. With it, the Vita goes from portable compromise to maybe I don't need working wrists to enjoy Metal Gear Solid. And of course, the Vita won't run Warzone or Fortnite or Roblox for that matter. I mean, it's not supposed to. What it does is everything else. You got retro classics, PSP gems, Vita exclusives, indies. You gotta remember, this thing is not a modern console. It's a portable archive, and it's better at being that than anything on shelves today. The Vita didn't outsell the 3DS or the Switch, but currently, it's quietly winning at something Sony never cared about: longevity. So yeah, I mean, like I said, it's versatile, it's moddable, and surprisingly comfortable. Basically everything Sony never wanted it to be. But what does that mean today? Why does this half-dead handheld still matter currently? Well, spoiler, because I'm pathetic. In 2025 or 26 or whenever it is, the Vita is basically a zombie. Sony killed it years ago, but the fans refuse to bury it. Instead of rotting in peace, it's still shambling around, asking if anyone remembers it. Well, we kinda do. Collectors treat the OLED models like sacred artifacts, paying ridiculous prices that make you wonder if they're actually buying a handheld or stocking Blockbuster. Modders treat it like Frankenstein's monster. Every year someone discovers a new trick, hack, ports, features, things that Sony never imagined and absolutely would have sued them for. For me though, the Vita isn't really a relic. It's my daily driver. On the bus, in bed, when I'm supposed to be doing literally anything else, it's the system I grab. Not because it's flashy, but because it's reliable. It's a handheld equivalent of comfort food. It's nothing fancy, but it gets the job done while you question your life choices. But the Vita lives on. And not because of Sony, but in spite of them. It's not really thriving, it's not dead, it's just existing. It's kind of like a ghost, a zombie, whatever metaphor you like. But it is proof that sometimes the best thing a company can do for a product is abandon it. So that us, people who actually care, can make it work. And no matter what I say, there's always that one guy, that one who insists the Vita had no games. And yes, I'm going to ruin his day too. If you're that guy that says, hey, the Vita had no games, so why does it even matter? That line gets said so much, it's basically become the system's obituary. But it's not true. What it didn't have was the marketing or the true support. Sony kind of treated the library of the Vita like a side project. You had a few great titles slip through here and there, Uncharted, Pure Away, Killzone, but then Sony quietly left the building. Meanwhile, Nintendo was running press tours for every 3DS game like it was the second coming of, well, you know who. Sony, they kind of acted like the Vita was a bad Tinder date they didn't want to talk about. So the myth stuck, but not because of the hardware or because it was weak. No, it was because Sony started the thing and then blamed the Vita for dying. And you want to know the real kicker? All the stuff people brag about now with the Switch, the Steam Deck, the Vita was already doing. Remote play, console quality on the go, indie-friendly store. But the difference is Nintendo and Valve backed their console, while Sony didn't. So yeah, no games was never really the problem. The problem for the Vita was being a child from divorce. All in all, picking up the Vita now doesn't really feel like a purchase. It feels feels more like I'm reopening a chapter I closed way too early. And the thing is, the Vita reminds me of gaming when it was simple and fun. You just turn it on, play the game, and that was it. No patches, no updates, no 300GB downloads, just open the menu, I'm looking at you. It was fun. It was fun in the way games used to be, straightforward, a little clunky, but honest. Playing it now feels less nostalgia and more like a reset, something that I think a lot of us gamers need. And sure, the Vita didn't get the support it deserved. It didn't have the endless stream of blockbusters or marketing megaphone, but somehow it survived. Not because it was pushed, but because people refused to let it vanish. Collectors, modders, and people like me who just aren't ready yet to let go of handhelds that actually feel personal. That's why it kind of hits harder now, because it shows you don't really need the biggest library or the loudest hype machine for a console to matter. Sometimes you just need a system that makes you want to pick it up every day. And yeah, the Vita does that. So yeah, it's currently 2025 for me. Finally bought a PlayStation Vita, and instead of feeling like I'm late to the party, it feels more like I showed up to the wrong funeral. The Vita reminded me why I like gaming in the first place. It took me back to when it was simpler, easier, and honestly, funner. Yeah, I'm gonna use funner for this video. And yeah, well, that's it. That's my essay. A 20-minute eulogy for a console Sony abandoned. And I adopted like a stray cat with asthma, which means now I'm obligated to beg for likes and subscriptions before I collapse under the weight of my own poor life choices. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this little essay of mine. If you did, please leave a like and a comment. And if you didn't, hey, that's fine too. Subscribe if you want. If you don't, that's fine. I'll just keep talking to myself like I already do while playing handhelds from 2012. But hey, if you think ignoring me makes you safer, remember the Vita has a back touch panel. Yeah, nobody's safe.